Okay, picture this. You're looking at two farms. On one side, you've got this sprawling, massive estate, owned by a wealthy landlord, endless resources, the whole shebang. On the other side, there's this tiny, fractured little plot of land, worked by a farmer who's literally just struggling to put food on the table for their family. Now, if I asked you which of these farms produces more value per acre, basic logic and, pretty much every economics textbook out there would tell you it's the massive estate, right? I mean, economies of scale, fancy equipment, financial security, it just makes sense. But what if I told you that in reality, it's the exact opposite? Today, we are unraveling a seriously incredible economic mystery. Why on earth do the poorest, most resource-starved farmers actually produce the highest yields per acre? Welcome to today's Explainer. We're digging into something economists call the productivity paradox. To do this, we're taking a trip back to 1950s India, diving deep into some absolutely fascinating historical data to uncover the hidden and, honestly, sometimes pretty dark mechanics of agricultural economics. By looking closely at how different classes of farmers actually make their daily decisions, we're going to completely flip how you think about efficiency, productivity, and the true cost of the food we grow. All right, let's dive right into this. Back in the mid-1950s, the Indian government rolled out these massive farm management studies, or FMS for short, across a bunch of different regions. And when economists actually sat down and looked at the data, this glaring, massive paradox jumped right off the page. There was a clear, undeniable inverse relationship between the size of a farm and the gross value of output per acre. Let that sink in for a second. The absolute tiniest, poorest farms were churning out significantly more value from every single acre than the giant resource-rich estates. I mean, this completely shatters standard capitalist economic theory, which basically assumes bigger operations are just naturally more efficient. So to solve this mystery, we're turning to a truly brilliant, rigorous 1974 academic study by the economist Krishna Bhardwaj, which was published in the Economic and Political Weekly. Bhardwaj didn't just accept the paradox. She took that raw FMS data from regions like West Bengal, Uttar Pradesh, and Punjab, and completely peeled back the layers. She wasn't just crunching numbers. She was looking at the actual human behavior and the deeply entrenched social structures that were driving those numbers. She put it perfectly when she wrote, "The analytical challenge emanates from the interactions of varied institutional forms prevailing simultaneously in the agrarian economy." Okay, academic jargon aside, what she's basically saying is that you absolutely cannot take a standard textbook model of a clean, perfectly competitive free market and just slap it onto a messy, complex, semi-feudal farming society. The rules of the game, they are entirely different depending on exactly who you are, how much land you own, and crucially, who you owe money to. Now, initially, academics tried to explain away this crazy high productivity on small farms with your standard run-of-the-mill economic guesses. But let's systematically debunk those right now. Did the small farms have better technology? Nope. The data clearly shows all the modern equipment was hoarded on the larger, less productive farms. Well, were they just better managers? Also false. What about superior soil? The idea that good land gets subdivided more often? Well, while there's a tiny kernel of truth to soil variations, it's wildly incomplete and comes nowhere near explaining the massive, across-the-board output gaps we see in all these different regions. So the crucial point is, the real surface-level answer is something called the intensity of cultivation. Small farmers were quite simply working the land infinitely harder. We're talking about applying massive, staggering amounts of human labor, often just their own family's pure sweat, to a tiny fixed plot of dirt. They squeezed in irrigation wherever physically possible to allow for double cropping, and perhaps most importantly, they were making incredibly specific, highly intensive choices about what crops to actually plant. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, okay, so they're just way better at growing wheat or rice, right? But here's the kicker. When Bhardwaj broke the data down crop by crop, looking strictly at wheat in Punjab or just paddy in West Bengal, the small farm advantage literally vanished. Poof, gone. There was absolutely no systematic advantage for small farms when you looked at a single specific crop. This means the secret to their insanely high value per acre didn't lie in how they grew a specific plant, but rather in their overall mix of crops. And this is where the story gets really, really fascinating. The very small farms, we're talking families operating on razor-thin, terrifying margins, dedicated massive chunks of their tiny plots to high-value, incredibly high-labor cash crops. In West Bengal, they grew jutes. In Uttar Pradesh, it was sugarcane. Listen, these crops require grueling, back-breaking labor, they carry huge risks, but they yield a really high gross revenue per acre. Now, contrast that with the middle and large farms. Logic tells you that the rich farmers, the guys with all the capital to spare, would be the ones taking on the high-risk, high-reward cash crops. But they don't. The large farms mostly dedicated their vast, sprawling lands to much safer, way less labor-intensive crops. Think pulses, gram, sturdy cereals. They honestly only bothered messing with those high-maintenance cash crops if they had exceptionally good, absolutely guaranteed irrigation. So, this brings us to a massive, million-dollar psychological and economic question. Why? Seriously, why do the absolute smallest, poorest farmers, who are constantly hovering right on the brink of starvation, take on the most exhausting, risky cash crops imaginable, instead of just growing food to, actually eat? To understand the why, we have to pull our eyes away from the plants in the ground and look at the deep socioeconomic drivers behind the people planting them. And this brilliantly illustrates the fundamental flaw in applying standard economics to this situation. Think about your textbook profit maximizer. They balance marginal costs with marginal returns, right? If an extra hour of labor costs more than the crop it produces, they just stop working. Simple. But the small farmer, they are a survival peasant. They are not trying to maximize some abstract profit margin. They are trying to maximize their gross output just to avoid starving. They'll push their family to work an extra 20 hours a week on a tiny patch of jute, even if the strict economic return on that time is practically zero, simply because they desperately need that total pile of cash at the end of the season. To really wrap our heads around this, we have to humanize the statistics. Bardwaj breaks the peasantry down into distinct classes based entirely on their market power. The very small operate in pure distress and survival mode. The small play a defensive game, mostly just trying to shield themselves from market chaos. The middle farmers are the ones actually playing the market to their advantage, balancing their costs and returns. And the large farmers? They are the surplus generators possessing immense social and economic dominance. Basically, your class dictates your choices. Now check out this data on monetization, which basically just means how much actual cash a farm spends on its inputs. Notice this wild U-shaped curve in the West Bengal data. Both the absolute wealthiest large farms and the poorest very small farms have extremely high cash expenditures, but they're spending that cash for entirely different reasons. The rich spend cash because they are running highly commercialized modern businesses. But why are the poorest farmers, who literally have nothing to spare, spending so much cold, hard cash? The answer is a concept Bharadwaj calls compulsive market involvement. It's a heavy term, but here's what it means. The high cash spending of the very small group isn't business savvy. It represents deep, crushing distress. They don't have enough grain saved up from the last harvest to use as seeds, and they sure don't have enough food to feed their families while the new crops grow. So what happens? They have to borrow money to buy seeds and survive. And because they are now heavily in debt, they are literally forced to grow lucrative cash crops like jute or sugarcane just to pay off the insane interest on those loans. Let's move along and see how this builds into a truly terrifying trap: the vicious cycle of interlocked markets. See, in this agrarian economy, the markets for land, labor, and credit aren't separate things. They are completely interlocked, controlled by the exact same dominant individuals. Here's how it plays out. Step 1, the poor farmer desperately needs land or a loan. Step 2, the wealthy landlord or moneylender, who is very often the exact same guy, dictates absolutely terrible terms. Step 3, the landlord might even legally stipulate that the tenant must grow a specific cash crop. Step 4, the tenant then completely overworks themselves and the land, dumping immense family labor into the soil just to pay off the landlord, starting the whole brutal cycle over again. Actually, the data suggests landlords actively weaponize this exact desperation. If a landlord has a really nice stretch of highly productive, irrigated land, they won't lease it out as one big, efficient farm. No way. Their strategy is to slice it up and parcel it out into tiny, fragmented plots to multiple different tenants. By keeping the plots deliberately tiny, the landlord guarantees that the tenant simply cannot survive without putting in hyper-intensive, totally unpaid family labor. The landlord then swoops in and extracts a massive share of that artificially inflated gross output as rent. It's a rigged game. Now you might be wondering, well, why don't these small farmers just go find a regular wage-paying job somewhere else instead of overworking a tiny dirt patch? The harsh reality is a free, continuous labor market just doesn't exist for them. Family labor isn't freely mobile. It's not like you can always just pack up and leave your village. Off-farm work is super irregular and mostly seasonal. And worse, landlords often tie their land leases or credit to unfree labor. This means the poor farmer is contractually forced to go work on the landlord's personal estate during the busy harvest season, which is the exact time when they could have actually commanded a premium wage somewhere else. And what about those large landowners? Why are their farms so much less productive per acre? Well, because for the dominant rural class, exploiting the poor is actually vastly more lucrative than farming. A large landowner makes immense income from usury, which is lending money at exorbitant interest rates, as well as from general trade and, of course, extracting rent from desperate sharecroppers. Because they're making so much money off the backs of the poor, they have virtually zero incentive to invest the time, capital, and effort into intensively cultivating their own personal landholdings. So, as we pull all these threads together, we have to completely rethink our entire idea of efficiency. The fact that small farms in 1950s India had these incredibly high yields per acre, that does not equal economic superiority. It is not some heartwarming triumph of the plucky, hardworking small business owner. Instead, it reflects a desperate total lack of choices. This intense productivity is actually a glaring symptom of a deeply unequal, coercive, semi-feudal system where the poorest people are just squeezed for absolutely every drop of labor they have. Which leaves us with a pretty profound and honestly unsettling question to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. If the very highest agricultural productivity on paper is in reality driven by extreme human poverty, crushing debt, and systemic desperation, then what does true, sustainable economic progress actually look like? It really forces us to look way beyond just the yield per acre and demand that we start measuring the human cost of that output. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the data, and I'll catch you on the next explainer.